everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy's series on historical analogies. This is the 26th and final addition to the series, the lecture that is going to wrap everything up. We've already had one lecture, the previous one, the 25th installment, that was given in the form of a conclusion, and this is going to be the same. So this is yet another conclusion. We've had too much to conclude to put in one lecture. So we are going to continue where we left off in the previous lecture, and we're going to be talking a bit about Romanticism. So the previous notion was that Romanticism is a very peculiar, very special era or school of thought, or not just a stylistical formation, something much, much more than that. And something that encompasses our own period, something that we are still living in. I want to continue off of that, and I want to present this peculiar situation that we are facing in the previous, 300 years or so, or 250, it doesn't really matter. It's this idea that when we think about particular eras, or even stylistical formations, so something that is a bit more narrow, we are thinking about certain characteristics that these eras have. And we are thinking about major traits between them. So we could say that Renaissance is really very clean and very well composed, very organized and structured. We can say that Baroque is, less in all of these aspects. It's more wild, it's dramatic, it's over the top. We can then say that Neoclassicism that comes after Baroque is also very clean and very orderly. And then Romanticism is very wild and over the top and dramatic. And so we can see that not only these traits tend to swing back and forth, the pendulum of history of art, if you will, or history of ideas, rather, in general, because this is a more general notion, tends to swing between these things, between the notions of order and apparent disorder, between the aestheticism of beauty and aestheticism of ugliness. And these swings tend to happen in certain time periods, in certain frequency. Now, there's another thing to address here, not just that we go from one polar opposite to the other, but also there's this idea that while there are traits that define a certain stylistical formation or a certain era, they are more or less underlined, and all of the other traits also exist. Now, we can say that Baroque is quite famous for being dramatic, and this has been explored at reasonable length. And there is a certain focus in Baroque on light, that when we think about Baroque painters, especially in the north, especially if we think about Vermeer or Rembrandt, they really, really pay a lot of attention to light. And you can analyze their paintings, you can analyze their entire aesthetics and poetics, really, looking them through this particular prism, analyzing them, and saying that this probably is the most important aspect in all of the other aspects that a work of art, visual, plastic work of art can present. When you analyze a painting, of course, you can talk about line, you can talk about drawing, more broadly speaking, light, colors, all these other things, and we can say that certain styles are more invested in one or the other. We've given Baroque as an example that Baroque has a lot to do with light. Not just in the north, of course. If we talk about Caravaggio, he is a very famous Baroque painter. His whole thing is light. Chiaroscuro, dramatic tension between shadows and strong sources of light. So we can say that, of course, if you think about Baroque, you think about light, but you also think about other things. Baroque, of course, gives us very interesting color harmonies and very interesting color contrasts. You could say that a lot of these painters are phenomenally talented illustrators or draftsmen. You can say that they dealt with composition in a very intriguing, very original, unorthodox manner. But when we think about Baroque, we mostly think about what we said was initially the case. We thought about light. Now, when we think about Neoclassicism, on the other end, we mostly think about drawing, and we choose to look at Neoclassicism from this particular perspective. Drawing becomes a very, very important thing. You could argue the same about Classicism, which is kind of a French response to the Italian Baroque. And this then becomes more important as a trait than all of the other traits. Ingres has an entire theory developed around drawing being the structure of the painting and being the most important aspect of the painting. Not by accident, he is a phenomenal draftsman, so there's something to be said about that as well. And he clearly does not seek to harmonize all of the aspects of the painting. He clearly gives supremacy to the drawing, and this is really visible in his paintings. The thing is that when we're talking about neoclassical works of art, we are, of course, talking about all of the other aspects being present. It's just that one of them seems to be present more than the others. It seems that they have less importance as compared to drawing. What is very peculiar about Romanticism, and I'm saying again Romanticism as an era, as a more general thing, not as a stylistical formation that is necessarily connected to visual arts, is that we start having these particularities, and we start having these stylistical formations that invest themselves deeper and further into exploration of one particular trait, of one particular quality. Now, you could argue that light is, of course, very present in medieval painting. It is the key aspect of any orthodox icon, and then of any work of art that is influenced by an orthodox icon, and there are many of those. And of course, you can spend hours talking just about the light in the orthodox icon, and I hope we'll get there. I hope we'll have the time to do that because it's a tremendously interesting topic. What I am saying is that while we can talk about light in Renaissance paintings, while we can talk about light in medieval paintings, Romanesque and Gothic, especially Gothic, we say that light somehow has more to do with Baroque. Now, I would argue that Gothic paintings are not quite as invested in light and not nearly in the same manner as Gothic stained glass windows. That's where light becomes truly amazingly important. And I think we've covered this properly when we were talking about Gothic art and Impressionism, that we were mostly talking about stained glass windows, not necessarily Gothic paintings per se, because those are much more similar to Impressionism, and the connection is much stronger there than in Gothic paintings proper. So what I'm trying to say here is that if we're talking about any art pretty much from Gothic onwards, we are talking about artistic formations that are complete. And we are talking about art that, of course, has very well developed drawing and mass and color harmony and all of these other visual aspects of a painting. But when we get to Romanticism, broadly speaking, once we get to the 19th century, and especially once we get to the 20th century and then the 21st, we get to these fragmented stylistical formations that choose to focus on one trait in particular. Now, you could argue that Impressionism, that is a very, very important stylistical formation and is in many cases seen as the very beginning of modern art, focuses exclusively on color and to a certain extent on mass. More specifically, really, it focuses on light. Now, the thing to address in Impressionism is that it doesn't really feature a lot of drawing, or not a lot of drawing at all. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. You could say that Degas is a very important illustrator and that he draws. He is under direct influence by Ingres. You could almost argue tutelage. He acknowledges Ingres as his master and someone to look upon and someone to emulate for all. You could argue that Cézanne presents a very strong drawing, and you could argue that there are Impressionist painters who do give some structure to their paintings, like Cézanne, like Degas, but mostly when we're talking about Impressionism, if we're talking about Renoir, Monet, Sisley, Pissarro, we are talking about people who paint without drawing and whose explicit goal is to paint without drawing. Now, this is, of course, very different as compared to, let's say, Baroque or Renaissance or Mannerism or Neoclassicism, because there we have all of the other aspects present. It's just that some of them are more underlined than the others. Some of them are given more attention, where in Impressionism, and then I would argue almost every sequent stylistical formation after Impressionism, we clearly have focus on one or more traits of visual expression, or we have a very deliberate effort to exclude one of these traits. So when you're looking at, let's say, most of Expressionism and most of Expressionist paintings, you will see that in many cases they don't really feature a lot of mass. They're more like colored drawings Then there are paintings. Now, again, of course, there are exceptions to this. Otto Dix has an almost Renaissance technique in some of his paintings. And clearly we have mass, we have light, we have drawing, very important. But again, this is a bit of an exception. If we're thinking about other expressionist painters, we are thinking about, well, drawing that, again, has a very clear supremacy over mass or treatment of light. Not quite as important. So this is what starts happening in this period that is very interesting to us, broadly labeled as Romanticism, is that we start having this specialization. And of course, this is something that we already addressed through our course. We are just going over it again in a more of a recapitulation manner, trying to reach a conclusion. So if we are to follow different stylistical formations, we are to see and observe clearly that they focus more and more, that they go deeper and deeper, and that they leave behind many of the other previously discussed aspects of visual arts. So we can see that Renaissance or Baroque can be seen as totalitarian in a way. They try to assemble all of the aspects of painting and bring them together in a more or less harmonious manner. Whereas if we're talking about optical art, of course, we're going to be just looking at how colors and lines and shapes interact in a very simplistic manner. You could say the same thing about many other stylistical formations. In this particular case, pointillism, of course, is yet another one of them. Now, this doesn't only have to be visual. We are talking about visual arts here for mostly, but it can also be in terms of meaning and themes addressed and all of these other communicational aspects of a work of art. If we're talking about Dada or Neo-Expressionism, or if we're talking about Surrealism or consumerist art or conceptual art, we are really focusing on the message, and we are really focusing on what the work of art communicates and what is it all about, what does it mean. There's this whole thing of meaning of art, and this becomes really, really important, I would say, in the second half of the 20th century in a very explicit manner, but since the second half of the 19th it becomes becoming important. Terribly worded, I know, but bear with me. And the thing is that the same thing happens if we're talking about meaning. It gets fragmented, and it doesn't seek to give us this total worldview, as was the case in arts before. It seeks to address itself, and it seeks to focus on one particular aspect. So when we're talking about, let's say, pop art, clearly it's going to be about popular culture, it's going to be about mass media, the industrial society, and life inside that particular society. It's not going to pretend to have global and universal meaning, though I would argue that it does, despite this. It's going to really focus on one particular type of living, one particular set of circumstances. This is even more obvious if we're talking about consumerist art, because it's all going to be about consumerism, obviously. It's all going to be about ads and consumption and society of consumption and all those things. Again, mass media, industrial context, and so on. So we can say that this thing happens in Romanticism that clearly has to do with the Industrial Revolution, yet again, that we tend to focus and we tend to specialize and we tend to narrow our view of things as artists as well as audience. And this is something that can be observed chronologically, and I would argue thematically, because from dealing with the sacred, from dealing with cosmic drama, cosmic truths, and very total, and again, I mean, jokingly, kind of jokingly, but not really, totalitarian worldview that previous stylistical formations presented us with. Here we have more and more fragmented worldview. And this is something that, again, has to do with Romanticism. Not to go back to Schlegel and his entire thing, we've covered that in the previous lecture. And this is something I think that was really important to address. We didn't get to address many things here. This entire course was very much about eras. We did focus on particular painters more than the others. We chose to talk about let's say Picasso as a very representative example of Cubism and many other stylistical formations that he's gone through. But we didn't really talk about individual artists and the analogies we can draw with them as much as we could have. So you could say that we could have talked more about Picasso and his relationship with the Orthodox icon, as there's a lot to be said, especially his relationship with African masks and what he thought of as primitive art. We didn't really talk a lot about Brancusi or Modigliani and their relationship with the so-called primitive art. So I think our focus was more on stylistical formations. It was more general, and we didn't really quite get to go as deep as at times I wanted to towards personal examples of individual artists and what they were doing. So this is something that we may go back to. I'm thinking about perhaps doing another series of historical analogies, but that's going to be really focused on individual artists. So a place where we can talk about relationship between, let's say, Rodin and Michelangelo, because there's a lot to be said about that connection. And they share a lot of similar traits. Of course, Rodin saw Michelangelo as a very influential author and a great influence that he was quite upfront and honest about. So this is something we may go back to. I don't think we have properly explored the relationship, again, between so-called primitive art in the 20th century. I know that we have mentioned it a lot, but it's such an immensely important thing that no matter how much we talk about it, it seems like we haven't talked about it enough. So this is something that we may want to come back to in one of our sequent courses. Now, I want to address this very important phenomenon of not only focusing more and more, not only specializing more and more, but this whole idea of constantly turning back and constantly revisiting things. Now, if you're thinking about what happens in Romanticism in general from, let's say, second half of the 18th century to basically today, we are talking about these repetitive cycles that history of art seems to be cyclical. And this is something that we're going to come back to. Now, I want to address this on a larger scale, of course, as it happens from second half of the 18th century to today, but I also want to address it on a minor scale, not to say on a micro scale. What I'm talking about here in particular is the phenomenon of vintage. Now, if you have followed some of hipster culture, and if you're familiar with the term, if you were, let's say, were listening to vaporwave music, you knew that previous couple of years or decades were all about the 80s. So it was like all things 80s. 80s are back now. So we're into synth music. We're into that particular terrible fashion. Video games were being made with intentional pixels. So it was basically like we're going back to the 80s. There were a lot of 80s nostalgia, cinema, TV series. Stranger Things was, especially first season, it was all about 80s nostalgia, and so on. So there is this fascination with the 80s. Before that, there was a fascination with the 70s. And before that, as you can guess, there was a fascination with the 60s. Now, I'm not going to be a terribly lucid prophet when I say that we may expect that fascination with the 90s is soon to hit us. All things 90s are to come back. And this is to a certain extent already happening. So what's the deal here is that after 20 or so years, things become vintage, I think legitimately so, and then we can consider that we are no longer in the realm of, strictly speaking, contemporary art or contemporary pop culture, but we're talking about something that becomes a part of history, even though it's very recent history, and something that we can rehash and something that we can see as vintage. Now, this is really terribly interesting for the thing we're talking about, the course about historical analogies, because then what we do is that we start bringing it back. And we start, again, creating new content that is clearly inspired by something that has already happened, something that is, by definition, anachronous, outside of its own time. Now, anachronous content is, well, I would say the staple of all of history of art. You could argue that all of history of art is anachronous to a certain extent, and that's exactly what we're going to be arguing right now. Now, you think about let's say, early medieval period, because we've started talking about the early medieval period, we call it Romanesque because it basically takes us back to Roman architecture, to the Roman world. I'm not going to go over this again. I'm just saying it goes back to Rome. Most of medieval period really is going back to Rome one way or the other. So then the Renaissance happens. And again, we've covered this already, so I'm just going to gloss over it. And we rediscover antiquity yet again. And we're like, oh my God, antiquity was amazing. Yeah, let's go back to antiquity. Let's make statues and paintings like those people made. And then we go back to emulating antiquity one way or the other. So a similar thing happens with Baroque, with Neoclassicism, of course. I mean, even the title is all about classical art. And then, of course, with Romanticism. So we are always rediscovering the past. Now, Romanticism, yet again, is so interesting because it has this double fascination with the medieval period and with classical antiquity. And then what happens is that every sequent stylistical formation in every sequent era does more or less the same. It's like, oh, we're rediscovering the past. We did not know that our past is so amazingly interesting. And what happens is that we keep rediscovering past that is closer and closer to us, and that is less and less separated from us chronologically. So if you look at how we structure this course, we're going to talk about that a bit more a bit later, is that we have these connections, we have these analogies initially happening between periods that are centuries apart, but then they start becoming decades apart. Then they start becoming closer and closer together. Now, you could say that the very beginning of the course was Romanesque art and Neoclassicism, so there's centuries apart, literally. And then we were talking about Paleologian Renaissance and Romanticism, again, centuries apart. Gothic art and Impressionism, same thing. But then, once we start getting to Gothic Revival and Dada, we start talking about things that are much closer together. If we're talking about Romanticism and Expressionism, much closer together, not even 100 years. And this is only if we're talking about Romanticism in a narrow term, of course, as a stylistical formation, not as a whole thing. Because we've agreed that Expressionism is really but a branch of Romanticism seen in this larger worldview. Now, if we're talking about, let's say, Impressionism and action painting, it's even closer together. And if we're talking about Art Nouveau and consumerist art, it's even closer together. So we have these stylistical formations like, let's say, surrealism and the lowbrow art that even happen to a certain extent in the same time period. Now, of course, surrealism had its heyday, had its peak arguably in the 20s and the 30s of the 20th century, but, you know, people who lived back then and who created then, who died well after World War II, and they were surrealists, they still created. Magritte still created in the 40s and the 50s. Salvador Dali still created in the 40s and the 50s. And they were still around. They were still active. Their art was still interesting and sought after. So we have these connections between eras that are closer and closer together. Now, this is pretty interesting for myself and my contemporaries, that I was born in the 80s and that I vaguely remember, I mean, having been a kid, but I vaguely remember that entire period. And then I get to live through this whole 80s revival, 80s nostalgia and whatnot, music being made in the key of the 80s. So we can see that there is a shortening of repetition, and this is something that is quite a contemporary phenomenon, this whole vintage craze, and the pastis that are being made as such. So we are talking about this whole idea of, let's say, fashion that constantly circles, that we keep inventing same things, that we keep going back to same solutions. So there's a very strong cyclical tendency to be observed here. And this is something I wanted to focus on. Now, speaking of all things cyclical, there's yet another thing that I think is a bit more profound than what you just covered. And it's something that imposes itself as a conclusion when we are dealing with these eras and when we are dealing with impressions they create and the influences they exert. And what we're talking about here is basically connected to the premise that art was connected to the realm of the sacred for a very, very long period of time, much longer than it wasn't, this is for sure. And we have this constant dynamism, I would say, dynamics and constant tension in the world of history of art when we're talking about, again, Romanticism, when we're talking about modernity, about the industrial era. And the tension in question really has to do with secular versus the sacred. Now, if we want to properly address this, we want to go back a bit further in time. We want to address the Gothic period that we know, again, is very influential on Romanticism, very important. Gothic Revival, not to get over all of that, we've covered it previously. What happens in Gothic period, and I would argue in a very dramatic manner, is this reintegration of paganism into our mainstream culture. Now, why do I say this? Well, this is something I've written about extensively in my book, Notre Dame Fiat Lux. What happens is that the church starts communicating its message to the people through images in a very important manner. Not just images, but also sensual means. The church starts relying on things like not only light in stained glass windows, but music during the Mass, frankincense that is burnt during the Mass, touching and tasting the wafer, and sometimes wine. The church starts relying on all these things that initial Christianity was explicitly against. We know that the Bible is rife with references and clear instructions that we are not supposed to be using images. We're not supposed to build statues and paintings. This is very wrong. This is what pagans do. And this is not what Christianity nor Judaism is all about. It's a spiritual religion. It's something that has to do with your spirit, your immortal soul. And you should not deal with images. This is very, very clearly stated. And then you have, of course, a lot of Christian denominations who do not deal with images. Muslims do not deal with images. And this is a very, very important thing, especially if you think about the iconoclastic war, that there was this whole civil war in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, on the topic of should we use images or not. This was a topic so important that people decided to go to war over, and then destroyed a lot of churches, and they destroyed a lot of frescoes, etc. The thing is that since the Gothic period, we have this intrusion of paganism really into Christian art. And I think what is really ironic here and very funny and very interesting really is that it was the church, the main steward of Christianity, really the church, the Catholic Church, that brought about this change. That they were the ones who basically initiated using paganism and pagan means of communication so that they could better proselytize, so that they could spread their words, so that they could attract people who were still pagan, so that they could communicate their message to them in their own language, in language that they would understand, which was the language of images, which was, well, paganism. There's no two ways about it. And so this is something that I say is a very interesting paradox, that the church, the Catholic Church, very important institution, basically brings out or incorporates rather the main means of communication of its supposed enemy. So they integrate paganism into their own culture, into their own communication, and into their own dogma. Now, if we're talking about what happens then in the Romanticism, we are having a completely different thing. We have this whole idea of a supposedly secular society that comes along after the French Revolution. People don't want to have anything to do with the church anymore. They don't want to be religious. It's a whole thing. But this particular commotion starts producing something that can be seen as basically going back to spiritual art, going back to a spiritual way of doing things, releasing art from the clutches of matter, and going back to this premise that art is supposed to be spiritual and not carnal. Now, this starts happening in Impressionism, in a way. I mean, pre-Impressionism as well, but it starts happening very, very clearly with Impressionism that art wants to remove itself from meaning. It wants to remove itself from basically lustful, dramatic, sensual representations. It wants to be seemingly about nothing. Monet's paintings, as he many times have said himself, were about nothing. And it's this whole idea that art becomes more and more abstract. You could argue that Impressionism, and many art historians agree with this, Impressionism is the first step made towards abstract art. And abstract art, by definition, abstract, meaning not representative, non-formal, informal art, is about not depicting things. It's about depicting a pure play of visual tools, of visual means of representation, but it's not about a thing. It's never about something that you can recognize. This is what makes it abstract. And you can argue that Christianity, being all situated in the realm of the eternal, dealing with eternal souls, is all about, well, abstract. So you have this very, very, I would again say funny situation that A stylistical formation that is explicitly very bourgeois, very secular, very republican, very political. Impressionism was all of those things, is basically engendering a kind of art that is going back to what is fundamentally Christian, and that is going back to what was Christian before Gothic times, before we started having these luxurious Renaissance and Baroque bodies with beautiful muscular anatomies and spectacular physiques and all of this. So Impressionism starts dropping all of these things and it starts moving towards abstract art. And then if you look at all of the 20th century, really, you're looking at art that is more and more being detached from matter, that is more and more being purely spiritual. And this is, I say, very interesting, because you have people like Malevich, again, who posits his black square as an icon and clearly communicates his spiritual ambition. He says, I'm making icons. This is highly spiritual. What I'm doing, this is basically the new faith that we are creating. So they were not just creating a new economic system, a new political system, new ways of creating and distributing surplus value. No, they were creating new humanity, and with it, new spirituality. And this is an important thing to understand that we often overlook, that the entire communist context was not about destroying spirituality. It was about creating new spirituality. But yes, there was very, very strong communist spirituality. Not to get into all of that right now. The thing is that his work is deeply spiritual. If you think about Kandinsky, he authored a very large essay about spiritual in art. So clearly he was very invested in the topic. If you think about Mondrian, same thing. Yves Klein, a bit of a later reference, but still, these are all people who had very, very strong spiritual inclinations, and who saw their work as very, very strongly connected to the religious context. And we're talking about people who were, very important 20th century artists. So I find this, again, to kind of wrap this thread up, very interesting that out of the Catholic Church, which again is one of the most important Christian institutions in the world, I mean, probably the most important, because really, if you think about the size of the Catholic Church, it's much larger than the Orthodox Church or Protestant churches that are kind of scattered around and don't have such a strong central structure like the Catholic Church does. So by far the largest Christian denomination, the Catholic Church, basically engendered pagan art, and books have been written about connection between paganism and the Renaissance, and how the Renaissance was all about bringing back the idea of humanity that was around in pagan times. Now again, I would argue that this started with Gothic art. It started before Renaissance, but it doesn't really matter, because in both cases it's the Catholic Church that pushed for this. And they financed it pretty much. So yeah, they were responsible for it. And then when we started building the secular world after the French Revolution, and once we were starting to establish some sort of republics, then we started going back to, spiritual art. And spiritual in a very clear Christian optic, I would say. Very clearly Christian point of view. So yeah, this is a bit of an analogy to be addressed. I think we can possibly develop this into a single course, because it is really interesting. But it is what is going on. And this is something I wanted to address, again, perhaps in a special lecture, that 20th century, I mean 19th as well, but 20th more so, is so incredibly spiritual, and it's so incredibly religious. It's not religious within the decor of what we can recognize as a church art, but it really is. It just assumes a different decor. The entire structure, the entire mind frame is very much that. Now, you can also talk about something. I think I'm just going to gloss over this because we already covered it. It seems a couple of times, that if you talk about Duchamp, a very important artist from the 20th century, a very important influence. He's influenced a whole lot of art and a whole lot of artists. You can really talk about connection between The Fool for Christ and Duchamp, and you can talk about this whole idea of absurd that is so incredibly important for the context of the 20th century, and the concept of Fools for Christ, that even in this particular regard, it comes together. I would argue that the whole of theater of absurd, something that comes from the realm of literature, or absurdist philosophy, or absurdist thinking, and these are all very important impulses in the 20th century, that all has its roots in the concept of Eurydice, of Fools for Christ. So it's something that we already have. We already have this in the medieval period, but we continue to have it even past medieval period to this day, more or less. Now, I want to address another thing that is connected to what we were talking about, Duchamp and Malevich, and this whole idea of bringing back this medieval way of thinking under the spell of Gothic revival and all things Gothic. I want to address this whole idea how the past continues existing in our present. And this is a thing that we just have to address when we're talking about concluding this course, because it's all based on this premise that we build our future with the building blocks of our past. Truly, we build our present by building blocks that come from our past. And this is something that I think was made obvious in this course, because again, if you look at the structure and you look at how certain things repeat themselves over and over again in smaller and smaller cycles, this becomes apparent that truly we always go back to the past. Now, this is something that back in the day before the Industrial Revolution would not even be necessary to mention. It would just be a given, and it would be very redundant to even talk about it. But it is important to address nowadays because we live in a society that is incredibly invested in the notion of invention, the notion of creativity, of originality. And it has to do, of course, with industry, it has to do with science, it has to do with the constant need for innovation, arguably so that we could buy more stuff, so it drives consumption. But it also has to do with how we see individuality. We like to think that we are all incredibly special and that we are unique and that we are different and all these things that, of course, are not necessarily true. So this whole thing becomes important, and this is not this was not important for a very long period of time. No one was interested in innovating, really. And again, innovation was a derogatory term all up until the second half of the 18th century. If you were innovating, you were doing something wrong. You were basically insane. The whole idea was that you should repeat what was done, and you should try to achieve the same or greater level of perfection that was achieved by your predecessors. The whole idea was not to be innovative, but to follow the well-beaten path. Now, you know that today that's not the case. It's quite the opposite from that. So we want to address this whole idea that we keep going back to the past and that we look to the past more than we look to the future. Now, I don't want to go into why is this the case, because that would be a tremendously long lecture. I just want to mention a very important theory that we're going to go back to in sequent courses, especially when we start talking about what is art, because that's going to be an entire course unto itself. And I want to mention this theory that normally comes from the realm of literature, that I also think incredibly applicable in the realm of visual arts. So this was presented by T.S. Eliot, a very famous poet and art and literary critic, in his essay on history of literature. Now, he has presented this idea that history of literature is like a chain, and that every major author or every major work of art, if you will, exists in this chain. So it all goes back to Epic of Gilgamesh, if you will, or let's say Homer's epics, Odyssey and Iliad. Every time when a new ring is added to the chain, we basically reconsider the entire chain altogether. So every time we add something new, we look at the entire history of literature in a different light, and we reinterpret everything that has happened. So it's when something important happens in the world of literature, when a new classic appears, or when a new very famous or a successful work of art appears, work of literature in this case, it tends to change the entire realm. It tends to change everything. So imagine that we have an incredibly gifted poet today that appears and is very influential and is very important. So we are going to be reading Homer, that has been around for almost 3,000 years, in a different light, because the whole of context of literature will have changed thanks to this one addition. So what T.S. Eliot is trying to communicate here is a very interesting notion that every new work of art changes the whole of art in itself, that it's a dynamic, a living organism that we keep contributing to. and that when something new happens, when something important happens, it's an addition to an entire existing context. So we look at the whole of literature, or in this case, the whole of visual arts, or you could argue the whole of history of ideas, really, because it's applicable as well, as one whole. And we do not look at authors or entire eras, as we do in this course, as separate entities. No, they're all together. They all coexist in a way. And this is something that exists not only diachronically, but also synchronically. So we don't see this as a chain going vertically into the past. We also see it horizontally. It all coexists at the same time. And I would argue that this is pretty true, because if you study arts, or if you study literature or philosophy, it doesn't really matter. You kind of have to go through people who existed thousands of years ago, who created thousands of years ago. So you read their work, or you look at their work, you actualize them, you think about them. So they lived through you. They are present in your everyday life. It's not like they're long forgotten. I mean, many of them are, of course, but we are talking about the ones who have been preserved. So they continue to exert their influence, and they continue to exert, to actualize their ideas in contemporary period, as well as they will be doing in the future. And this is why we tend to look at this whole thing as one mass, or one block, one building, if you will. You can take any visual metaphor that you want. It doesn't really matter. And this is basically how we addressed these different eras, because we addressed them as very dynamic and very connected to one another. We were addressing tendencies that kept repeating themselves and that kept coming back to us in a more and more fragmented manner, for sure, but in a very clear intent. That we seem to be going back to certain themes. We seem to rehash and reactualize certain themes. This is just how things are. Now, there's another thing to address here, and it's really important. It's the connection between the material base and the general artistic circumstances and general historic circumstances. Now, why do I say this? Well, we already addressed the fact that we have this acceleration happening. If you were to follow the entire courses, you were to see that first it was analogies between eras that were centuries apart, and then they started getting closer and closer decades apart, and then they basically started coexisting, all the last of them. This has to do with the general idea of acceleration that comes to us with the Industrial Revolution. Now, you can think about this. If you were to live just before, let's say, 400 years ago, or 500 years ago, it doesn't really matter, especially if it's 2,000 years ago. You could have lived entire generations, really, without having seen any of the important technological advancements. This means that, let's say, your great-great-great-grandfather and your great-great-grandfather, and then your great-grandfather and your grandfather and your father and yourself and then your son, you would live exactly the same kind of life. You would not see any advancement. You would not see any breakthrough technology that would change the world. No, none of it. And this was pretty much the case, more or less, I mean, of course, up until the Industrial Revolution. I mean, there were advancements, but they were not that terribly important. Now, what happens with the Industrial Revolution is completely the opposite. We have this immense explosion of technology, of scientific discovery. We have changes that are truly earth-shaking, that are life-changing. Changes that are life-changing. Yeah, this is, again, very poorly worded. But this is the thing. Now, I can talk from my own perspective. Again, I was born in the 80s. I'm 42 now. We are recording this in 2025. I clearly remember the world before the internet. I clearly remember the world before cell phones, before social networks, before all of these things that are, almost unimaginable to live with nowadays. I mean, for a certain part of the planet at least. I remember the world before YouTube, and I'm recording this for YouTube. So I have this clear memory of, let's say, the world with only phones and no cell phones. And I was actually 20 or so when I started using cell phones, which is to say that I spent 20 years of my life without a cell phone. 20, yeah. And these are all big changes. If you think about how much the world has changed on account of social networks, for worse more than for better, if you think about how the world has changed on account of YouTube and on account of all these other services that we use, that you have, instant delivery today, and you can buy something online and receive it the same day, which was unimaginable. I mean, just the concept of buying something online was unimaginable. The concept of online was not terribly imaginable. You're getting my point. So within one lifestyle, I witnessed personally, and not just me, but anyone who is of my age and who comes from reasonably similar context, we have experienced tremendous changes in our lifestyle. That we spend most of our days on a computer, that we spend most of our days connected on the internet. This was not the case 30 years ago. And we'll continue experiencing other changes in our lifetime. Now, you can say the same thing about our fathers. You can say the same thing about our grandparents, that some of them lived without electricity. This was not a terribly strange thing for the generation of my grandfather. Certainly not a terribly strange thing for the generation of my great-grandfather. Doesn't really matter which part of the world you come from, even if you come from a very developed first world country. I can tell you, for example, that here in Paris, where I currently live, you can still find apartments that clearly were not made to have indoor plumbing, that clearly did not have, let's say, bathtubs or shower cabins that you see were jammed into later, but were not meant to have them. You can see apartments that were never meant to have refrigerators. To this day, you can see these special holes next to windows where you would put food inside. It would be basically on the outside of the heating of your apartment. It would be on the outside, so that you could keep your food chilly. You have people still with cave in Paris. So this is basically like a type of a cellar where you put your food in because it's cooler, etc. So what I'm saying is that we've had these generations and generations where we are witnessing firsthand a tremendous change of technology and of modes of production. And of course that this change is going to be evident in how we produce art and how we interpret art. Because again, if you were to live 500 years ago, nothing was changing so that you could observe it, especially if you were living thousands of years ago. Of course, that's whatever constituted our consciousness, whatever dealt with art, with generally culture, with philosophy, etc., would not be changing that fast. It would not be subject to tremendous changes or innovations. But then this whole thing, changes after the Industrial Revolution. And this is why we're talking about Romanticism, because it has a lot to do, of course, with the Industrial Revolution, and it has a lot to do with the world that is changing. And you can see whatever is happening to the world is happening to the world of art as well. This constant fragmentization, this constant specialization, this constant narrowing of our focus, this happens in art because it's connected to our means of production, and it's connected to how we live our lives. It's connected to how we create things in factories, etc. So I think this is something that's important to understand even when we're talking about historical analogies, especially when we're talking about historical analogies, because more so than ever, we have this tendency to look to the past. We have this need, really a deep need to look to the past, because thanks to the industrial process, we feel like we live less authentic lives. And this is a whole thing. We've partially covered it in our previous courses. It has a lot to do with the question of sense and the purpose and substance and all these things that were apparently lost in the industrial world. And the speed with which things are changing certainly contributes to that. Because again, I don't have to explain this. I live in a world that is very different than the world of my parents, and my parents lived in a world that was very different than the world of my grandparents, and so on. Whereas some of my ancestors, or your ancestors 500 years ago, would not see any difference. Literally, they could go for generations without changing anything, without changing the way they eat, the way they work, the way they wear clothes, the way they live, shortly. Now, we want to address another very important thing that has to do with Romanticism, and it has to do with modernity, with the industrial modernity, and that has to do with what we are talking about now, this whole idea of returning to roots, this whole idea of returning to whatever is fundamentally human and whatever is fundamentally artistic. And this is what's been happening. If you were to observe all of our lectures, you could have gotten to the same conclusion yourself. It clearly has something to do with street art and this whole idea that you do not create art only for churches or for museums or for galleries, you know, institutions that are highbrow, that are elegant, that are cultured, or that feature culture. No, you create them in the streets. And I find this really interesting. I really like street art for this particular reason. Because if you go back to the very beginning of art, or beginnings, one of beginnings of art, if you talk about cave paintings, you are talking in most cases not necessarily about temples or about sacred places. You are talking about dwellings. People lived in caves and they painted their walls where they lived. In most cases, these paintings were found in places that were habited. Some of these cave paintings are in the more remote locations, but some of them, if not to say most of them, were really made where people actually lived. Now, why is this so important? Well, it completely breaks the whole idea of entering a museum or a church as in entering a temple. Now, what happens when you enter a temple or a church, I mean, it's really the same, is that you walk into a different strata of reality. You are no longer in reality as such. You are on consecrated ground. I mean, this is a very important thing for any denomination. Christian, Muslim, it doesn't really matter, Buddhist, you are entering a special place where sacred is concentrated, where reality is concentrated. And we talked about this. Now, the main difference between this idea of concentration of reality, concentration of substance, concentration of meaning, super reality in a way, has to do with the church, has to do with the temple or a mosque. It's all the same in this particular regard. And it has to do with this idea that you're in a special place. Well, Romanticism goes against it because we don't have special places anymore. We want to create art that is indifferent to this. We want our entire existence to be sacred, not to have sacred concentrated in certain buildings or spaces. It could be a sacred grove, for example, in pagan perspective. No, we want everything to be sacred. This is going back to a more of an animist point of view and turning everything into a sacred space. So if you think about how the temple functioned, really, in pre-Christian times, if you think about Babylonian temples or Egyptian temples, to a certain extent Greek temples as well, you're really talking about the center of a community. You're talking about something that was not just a place of worship, but it was also a bank. It was a place where people kept their goods, where they stored treasures. Famously, the first Judaic temple was built on a place where they threshed wheat. The whole idea was this is a tremendously important place for the life of that community. So this was a wheat threshing place. It had the black and white tiles to symbolically represent the threshing of the wheat. So it's basically a place that has immense importance for its community, but in a very practical sense. It's in everyday life sense. And the street art is really about basically creating art that is there in a shared public space, not in a gallery where it's protected behind a glass, where you sometimes have to pay to enter to the museum. So they want to do away with this whole idea of concentrating sacred to the one place. No, everything is to be sacred, like is the case with animism. Every tree, every rock, every stream has a life, has a soul, has substance, and is sacred as such. And this is something that, again, starts happening with Romanticism because, again, we feel as if we're being removed from what is essentially human, from what is essentially organic and authentic. And so we want to fight against this. This, I think, is a very good way of understanding street art and connecting it to cave paintings because it really happens on a wall and it happens, again, in a public space that is shared by everyone. So this is something that I would like to conclude with. I would like to conclude with this whole idea of tradition being in need of being retaught. We need to rethink tradition. We think a lot about this, especially in the 19th and the 20th and the 21st century. We tend to look back to the past, and we often tend to forget that the very concept of tradition also has to do with the industrial modern period, and that wasn't necessarily something we were thinking about a lot before it happened. So it has to do really with the cyclical way in which we've addressed these different eras, in which we connected them. It has to do with repetition, with going back to the source. I think it would be interesting for everyone involved to go back. You don't necessarily have to listen all of the lectures again, though you can. But just to think about how they come to repeat one another, how we start, let's say, with Romanesque art and neoclassicism, and then how it's neoclassicism and analytical cubism, and then how it's analytical cubism and Harlem Renaissance, and the whole context that that produces. So it's about repeating, and it's about always going back to the past. But the past, as you can see, is always our idea of the past. It's not really the past. It's something that we have present as an image. And it's an image we create. This is an important thing to understand. It's an image that we always create and recreate. Our past is never static. It's never objective in this particular regard. And this is something that I really wanted to address and kind of to conclude with, because it's something that has to do with how we envision our future, how we see ourselves, how we see our present time. And it's something that, again, we constantly recreate. I hope this whole thing made sense. I hope we concluded this course in a pleasant and a reasonable manner. I thank you for your attention. This has been a great experience for me, and I hope that the next course we start doing is going to be, well, as interesting or more so than this one is. So again, thank you for your attention, and see you all soon. Bye.